podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
You're listening to Humans of Speedway. My guest in this episode is someone who currently is the chairman of the Speedway Riders Benevolent Fund. But prior to that was one of British Speedway's longest-serving referees. If you've ever wondered what it's like to be a referee, how you become one, what the training's like, and what the job actually entails, you're about to find out. For over 28 years, Paul Ackroyd ruled over some of British Speedway's biggest meetings, including 3 British finals and a number of test matches, to name just a couple. But of course, being a referee, you can't please all the people all the time.
He was told, along with everybody else, do not do this, because if you do, you'll suffer an exclusion. And the place went crazy, and I was lucky to get out alive, to be honest.
More tales from the box on the way, but we're also going to talk about the Speedway Riders Benevolent Fund and the Ben Fund Bonanza meeting, which is a real key part of the fundraising calendar for the world's only charity dedicated to helping injured Speedway riders, of which Paul is the chairman. And he's going to reveal a couple more riders joining the lineup as well. So let's welcome our guest, to Humans of Speedway, Mr. Paul Ackroyd.
Hello there, and thank you for including me in the programme.
Well, it's great to speak to you once again, and you are a history maker. You're the first person to be on twice on this series, and there is a reason for that, because you were on before largely to talk about the Speedway Riders Benevolent Fund last year and the fundraising efforts that you were having last year, of course, without the Ben Fund Bonanza. And we spoke with Roddy McDougall and with Mitchell Davey, who was doing a fundraising effort at that time. But please do go back and listen to that episode to find out much more about the work of the Ben Fund. This year, though, we're going to find out more about Paul Ackroyd, the referee, but also the Ben Fund Bonanza, which is back on the calendar.
Yes, it is. We're very pleased that we're able to put one together again this year. Obviously, it was sadly missed last year. But no, we're ready to rock for 2022. Historically, we've always been the first meeting to go ahead, the start of each season, but a little bit of a change this year. The venue, which is Peterborough, the showground wasn't available the first sort of 2 weeks or weekends in March, hence why we're going for Sunday the 27th, which was the first availability for that venue. But that in turn has allowed a few other meetings to take place prior to ours, and it'll give the riders a little bit of practice as well prior to their season.
And it's still the early part of the season, isn't it? It's still before the real action begins in the league and the main competitions. I know there's 1 or 2 sort of League Cup matches and stuff going on at the start, but aside that, you are still ahead of the main part of the season and probably the last big sort of warm-up event for many of the riders as well.
Yes, indeed. The riders look at these meetings as an opportunity of testing their machinery and getting themselves back into shape again, getting their fitness levels back up. And so they always use our meeting and other testimonial or farewell meetings to that end, as well as helping the cause, whether it be a rider with a benefit meeting or helping with the Benevolent Fund.
It is a hugely important organisation for Speedway riders, isn't it? And that's another reason, of course, why they're wanting to turn up and race in this meeting, is to show that gratitude for this unique charity in Speedway, because I think it'd be hard pushed to find any rider that at some point hasn't been injured. And, of course, going into the season ahead, who knows who might need your services, unfortunately. But it is a way of saying thanks for the riders as well, isn't it?
Yes. When I look at the lineup that will be on show at Peterborough, I think 100% of the riders will have had some help from us at some point during their racing careers. And the very, very pleasing aspect of the riders who are going to take part, every single one is a volunteer. They have contacted us and said, we want to be in that meeting. And so I'm really pleased with the rider reaction and the way they're supporting the event.
And just tell us about how important this event is for the Benevolent Fund in terms of, your fundraising, really, because it is the big event and it's something that you've had to do without the last couple of years because of the restrictions and everything. But it is, hugely important to the Benevolent Fund in supporting you for the year ahead, isn't it?
It is. The Benevolent Fund, the Bonanza meeting, that normally generates about 35 or 40% of our annual income each year. So it's vital. It also gives us a kickstart to the season financially with the cash flow. And it's so important. But the spin-off that we get from the meeting goes on and on throughout the whole season. And so, we find people picking things up, a few months after the Bonanza meeting, but it's all relative to what happened on that day. And it's putting the charity into people's minds once again. But it's hugely important for us, and it gives us that kickstart.
Okay, let's have a look at the lineup then, Paul, for what you've got at the Ben Fund Bonanza so far, because you've announced a few riders, and you're announcing 2 more riders right now as well that are joining the lineup as well. So who have we got, and who's adding to that lineup?
Well, to start with, we've got 3 Peterborough riders, which we always need, and they were the league champions last year. So it's very important that their fans have their own favourites to shout and to follow. So we have Scott Nichols, Jordan Palin and Ulrich Ostergaard. So they're representing Peterborough. And then following on from that, we've got Charles Wright, Danny King and Sam Masters. So that is a really good, solid combination there. And in this week, we'll have 2 Kings Lynn favourites, which will be Lewis Kerr and Thomas Jorgensen.
Well, Lewis Kerr, we spoke to in the previous episode of Humans of Speedway, and he touches on some of the injuries that he's had, including, one particular massive crash that he had racing for Newcastle. And no doubt the Benevolent Fund were of huge support to Louis and his family, particularly then.
Lewis has been unlucky to suffer several quite serious injuries. One in particular, I remember, I think it was at Peterborough, actually. And I remember speaking to his wife, who was in tears on the telephone, and we were helping her. I think we put her into a hotel close to where Lewis was. And I remember sharing quite a few hours of discussion with Lewis's wife, trying to support her, and obviously we gave Lewis the financial support that we would give anybody.
And as you mentioned there, that support can be from anything from making sure they've got a place to stay and some food and whatever money they need in the short term, through to the bigger bills, of course, because if a Speedway rider isn't racing and they're laid up in hospital, of course, the last thing you need to be worrying about is mortgage payments and so on. And so that's why the Ben Fund steps in to take those extra stresses away.
Yeah. I mean, once a rider is wiped out and, you don't know where they're at in their personal lives with mortgages, bank loans, finance and so on. So, the partner or wife, quite often, as we all would panic and wonder, well, where are we going to get fed from? Where's the money going to come from? And so we're able to give that reassurance that we'll take care of things until the rider is back on his feet and is able to go out and earn a living once more.
And it's important to make the point as well that this is a charity that helps any professional Speedway rider racing in Britain, regardless of your nationality. Thomas Jorgensen, for example, is also racing in the Ben Fund Bonanza, and an example of an overseas rider who's benefited from this unique charity as well. Yeah,
several years ago, Thomas, he's picked up 1 or 2 injuries along the way, and we've given Thomas the support that he needed at the time. So yes, he's been a beneficiary from the Benevolent Fund over the years.
Let's have a look at the details then for people that want to come along. Tell us all the info that they need, Paul. It is actually on Mother's Day, but I know that you've got some plans there to help lure the mums in. What's the details?
Okay, Sunday the 27th of March at 2 p.m. at Peterborough Speedway. The gates will open at 12 noon. The ticket prices are £20 for adults, £18 for concessions, and £8 for children over the age of 10 to 16, and kids under the age of 10 will go in for free. The programme will be £4. It's Mother's Day, so every female stroke mother who comes through the gate is going to get a little gift from our mascot Ben, just to remind them that it's Mother's Day. And 2 ladies who will do the meeting trophy presentation at the end of the afternoon. They will also be doing that from a Mother's Day point of view. So a whole sort of theme there, because a lot of mums will be missing out on their Mother's Day treat, but hopefully the Speedway will give them that treat. In the meeting, we're planning on a 20-heat meeting with a semi-final and final, and we're hoping to have a 5-rider semi-final and a 6-rider final. So that will be pretty tasty in that respect. Neil Vatcher is bringing along some of his under-16 riders, and they'll perform in 4 demonstration races throughout the afternoon. And likewise, we always like to include our veteran riders, and so a handful of those will be coming up with their Jap machines and machines from the 50s and 60s, and they'll do a few demonstration laps also. So we're going to try and make it a very fun family event, given the day of Mother's Day, and all we'll need is some nice weather.
Yeah, well, fingers crossed for that. That's the only thing that's out of your hands. But yeah, it sounds like a terrific event. And just a general overview of the Benevolent Fund, really. And we've talked about what it does, but obviously this has been running for quite some time. It's very unique, the only one in the world, really, the only charity of its kind to look after Speedway riders who become injured in Speedway in this country. Just give us an overview of how unique this charity is and when it leaps into action.
Well, it's unique, as you say, because it's the only one in the world. And I do know there are people in Poland who keep talking to me and saying, we really need to get something out there. And one guy has suggested that we look at that and see whether we can give them a helping hand in getting something started. But it is unique and it's very special. Speedway is a very close family. It's a very close shop, and people are so generous and helpful. And it's a good selling point for Speedway. It's one of the better stories that Speedway can tell here in Britain, and it's a very worthwhile charity.
Get down and support the Ben Fund then, and in return for your donation, you get some great Speedway and a great lineup for the 27th of March at Peterborough Panthers Speedway, the East of England showground, 2:00 in the afternoon. Don't miss it.
Just one little point with the lineup. We're desperately trying to make it so that every club in the top 2 leagues have a rider present, and it's looking as though we're going to achieve that. So every club in the Championship and Premiership, there's a rider there for everybody to come from their team to support.
Wow, there you go. You see, what more excuse do you need? Riders from across the top 2 leagues, and the latest 2 additions being Lewis Kerr and Thomas Jorgensen. So something there for the Scunthorpe and Redcar and Kings Lynn fans, of course, as they are added to the bill. The 27th of March, it's Mother's Day. It's at Peterborough Panthers Speedway at the East of England showground, 2:00 in the afternoon. Get down there if you can and support the riders, but of course, most importantly, supporting this wonderful unique charity, the Speedway Riders Benevolent Fund. And we're going to find out more about its chairman, Paul Ackroyd, next, because, of course, prior to being the chair of the Benevolent Fund, Paul Ackroyd had a long career as a top-class British Speedway referee, and he's presided over some of the great names of Speedway through the 80s, the 90s, the noughties, you name them, he's refereed them. And, of course, he's got some great tales to tell from inside the referee's box and the general life of a referee as well. Find out more in the next part of Humans of Speedway, coming in a sec. This is Humans of Speedway. If you haven't already, make sure you hit the follow, like, or subscribe button, or whatever it is on the app that you choose, to make sure you don't miss any new episodes as soon as they arrive. Make sure that they get delivered to your device as quickly as possible. In this episode, we're chatting with Paul Ackroyd, who, as we've heard already, is the chair of the Speedway Riders Benevolent Fund. But prior to that, of course, Paul had a long career as one of British Speedway's top referees, and he's presided over British finals, over Great Britain test matches and big meetings like that, all the way through all of the leagues as well, through the 80s, the 90s and into the noughties. And if you haven't made the connection yet, of course, refereeing runs in his family, because Craig Ackroyd, who is one of the Grand Prix referees now at that level, is Paul's son. So we'll find out more about refereeing and what it all entails. But first of all, Paul, how did you get involved in Speedway in the first place? What was your introduction to it?
Well, firstly, I was taken to Speedway when I was probably about 2 years old, to Bradford, to Odsal Stadium, back in the 1950s, and continued going there right up until it closed, around about 1959, I think it closed. Then it reopened again at Greenfield Stadium, a small greyhound stadium. And as a young teenager, I used to go there. And then sadly, Bradford closed completely. And Halifax reopened in 1965. And I was there on the first ever meeting at Halifax, and continued to go there throughout my early teenage life. And we would add to that trips to Sheffield or Bellevue, or Leicester or somewhere else, and obviously to Wembley most years. But I grew up as a teenager following Halifax Dukes. And during that later period, I began to feel I'd like to do something in the sport in some way or other. And in 1979, there was an advert in the Speedway Star asking, would anybody be interested in becoming a Speedway referee? Speedway referees at that period of time, a lot of them were the old ACU stewards. The referees used to be called stewards back in those days. And so a lot of these chaps were knocking on in age, and the Speedway Control Board at the time, they needed to get an influx of younger people. And I thought, that sounds really interesting. And I applied for an interview and was accepted for an interview, and headed off to Belgrave Square, which is where the ACU premises were at the time, and did an interview. And a few weeks later, I was told I was accepted as a trainee referee, along with around about 20 other people of a similar age group to me. And so from at the end of 1979, going into 1980, my role had changed completely from following Halifax Speedway to going into refereeing, which meant I couldn't support any team, because as a referee, you obviously weren't allowed to follow a club. And I was told, do not go to Halifax Speedway for 2 years, and which I didn't do, wasn't allowed to go. And in many ways that was good, because some of the riders from that era had then retired and moved on. So you lost the contact with the club as it was, and you became quite independent. So in 1980, I set out on my training by being allocated to Bellevue at Hyde Road, and my remit was to attend every meeting there with the visiting referee. And during the season, you would probably get 20 different referees coming each week. And I was also asked to visit as many other tracks, excluding Halifax, as possible. And so I started going to Bellevue week in and week out. And towards the end of the first year, we had to take an exam. And if you were successful and passed the exam, you're allowed to continue your training. So that was my introduction into Speedway, or into refereeing.
Everything has changed in Speedway over the years, and particularly over that time scale from late 70s, early 80s through to now. What are the differences in the training regime for a referee? I think one thing is still the constant, and that it takes a long time to qualify to be a referee, doesn't it? But how has it changed over that time for you?
Nowadays, a referee has a mentor. A senior referee or a trainee referee has a mentor who looks after his welfare and his learning process and his progression. And so they have somebody to turn to all the time now. Whereas when I was training, you're pretty much on your own. Some of the referees were very good at the time, very helpful, and always said, you can always speak to me, ring me up if you have a problem. And some of the other referees weren't particularly good at training. So from that perspective, nowadays it's much, much better. And the progress of a trainee can be monitored more closely. And so for now, I think it's quite good the way it's structured.
For you, though, to really have Bellevue and Hyde Road, we know about the great racing that track produced, but also the riders of that era as well. Some great names of Speedway, and legends that people would call them now, that you were getting to watch over every single week. What a fantastic place to learn your craft.
Bellevue was full of excellent riders. You had Peter Collins and Chris Morton at that time, I think Peter had already won a world championship. But you had those two exciting riders. You had Andy Smith, who was a 16-year-old. He'd come bursting out and winning races for fun. And there was a lot of characters. And Bellevue was very good because it showed you the discipline of how a Speedway meeting should be run. It was run very tightly in those days because the fairground was still active then. And they had to have the meetings finished by 9 o'clock, dead on the dot. And the staffing there, it was all prim and proper, very similar to how Coventry Speedway was run when Charles Ackroyd was around.
One thing that we don't have so much now is the sort of theatrics, if you like, from some riders. We don't have riders like that anymore, and a lot of people, talk about the phone being on the centre green or whatever, and the rider coming out and having a barney with the referee on the phone and all that kind of stuff. We miss that, but were you on the receiving end of any of those kind of situations?
Many times. Life was different then. The relationships between the riders and the referees were I think they were quite different. And the riders are not so accessible nowadays. And I think the sport has become a little bit sterile in that, and the fun element has been taken away from it. But, the riders, we always used to meet in the bar after the meeting. The riders would be there with the fans. I would go along, have a chat with them, and it was one big team. And we'd had arguments or disagreements during the meeting, but that was always put to bed then. And we were all in it together. And, some of the riders who I grew up with in that era, it was just so different. But nowadays, they're jetting off straight after the meetings to the airports and this, that and the other. So I don't think there's the close contact that there was back in the 80s, certainly.
Through the course of a season, the riders and referees are going to encounter each other multiple times. Were there any particular riders that you had sort of an ongoing relationship with, if you like, and the story moved on from one meeting to the next, but perhaps the banter, the form, if you like, followed you around?
I mean, back in 1980, the tape touching rule wasn't in place, so riders were allowed to charge into the tapes and come back in. And of course, during that era, Ollie Olsen and Ivan Major, they were still around. And so the starts were very hard to get a particularly fair start. And we always had riders who particularly tried to cheat by going into the tapes and coming back. And we had a lot of banter during that time. And I used to try very, very hard to make it fair for the other 3 or 2 riders who were stationary. And I had my own little ways of dealing with that. But, some of the banter just went on and carried on for the whole season and beyond that.
And 2 of the names you mentioned there, Ivan Major and Ollie Olsen, 2 of the greatest ever riders who, at the point at where you're refereeing, they would have achieved much of their glory and their place in history was assured. When you've got riders like that on the phone having an argument with you about whatever it is it, do you think, in their minds, try and use their status in the sport as perhaps a bit of an influence over you?
Well, they're just the same as anybody else. And when you're refereeing, believe it or not, you don't. All you think is red, blue, white, yellow, and not a name under the helmet. And when you're watching a race as a referee, quite often you don't know who the rider is. And that might sound ridiculous to the fans, but it's true. All it is red, blue, white and yellow. And when somebody comes to the phone, it's the rider in white. And yes, it's Ivan or Ollie or somebody like that. But everybody has to be treated exactly the same and equally as fairly. So that's the way I always conducted it.
We rarely see a referee change their mind when a rider is on the phone to them. And usually the decision's been made, and obviously it's down to an explanation, isn't it, for the referee to explain his thinking. But has it ever happened? Does it happen where a referee changes their mind? Does it happen to you or anyone else, where that rare thing has actually happened, that the referee's changed his mind on a decision?
Very, very rare. The only time I ever did that was when I went back to referee at Halifax, and a rider called John Titman, he was riding, I think, for Leicester by then. There'd been a crash on the 3rd and 4th bend, and I excluded a rider, and John Titman, he rang up and he said, "Paul, you've got that wrong. It was my fault because my steel shoe came off. You wouldn't see that, and it was my fault." And I congratulated him and amended the result and excluded him instead. So that is the only time I've ever done that. Thing is, you see, referees can't change their mind, because if you're refereeing a meeting where there is no TV, there is no way of looking at a replay at all. And certainly for the majority of referees' careers, they don't have that facility. So you make an instant judgment, and you've always got to believe that what you've done is right, and never ever doubt that, even if you're wrong. And you might look at a DVD or video later and say, "Cracky, I was wrong," but at the time you believe you're right. And the minute you begin to doubt yourself, then that is a slippery slope into losing confidence. And if you haven't got the confidence, then you couldn't referee and adjudicate the meeting.
When we think of referees, obviously we think of their part in the meetings and making the big decisions and pressing the buttons to let the tapes go up and excluding riders. But there's much more to it than that, isn't there? And I think especially over the years, the workload has changed, has increased. Give us a look at the work that fans don't see for a referee, the stuff that goes on long before the meeting and long after the meeting that is still part of the job beyond the 15 heats that you're sat watching?
There is. I mean, there's a build-up to the whole thing. Firstly, you got to sustain 2 years training, and out of 20 training referees, probably only 3 or 4 will make it to the end, because the others, the dropout rate is high, because it's not what they thought it was, because they struggle with the travelling, in having time off work. They struggle with confrontation and people being a little bit aggressive towards them, and they don't get the satisfaction from it that they thought they would. So, 3 or 4 out of 20 is not a lot. And somebody who's sustained 2 years of training, that really shows that they are still keen and motivated and wanting to carry on. And nowadays, the preparation for a meeting is colossal compared to what it used to be. A referee nowadays has to be at the meeting 2 hours before. Prior to that, they have to have checked all the riders' averages, checked with the governing body that every rider present is correct and is legally bound to race in that meeting. And there's a lot more health and safety issues nowadays that the referee has to look at and is responsible for. So in terms of actually running the meeting, the 15 races, deciding on whether red knocked white off, that is one of the smaller parts of the referee's job. It's the part that gets the most exposure and the part that the referees get the most criticism for, but it's not the biggest part of the job. And there is a lot to it, and it's quite draining, but it's also quite rewarding. And one of the biggest issues nowadays is travel, because, a journey that would take 2 hours 10, 15 years ago now takes 3 hours. And inevitably on your way home, the motorway is closed for repairs and there are diversions. So the whole package is now literally a half a day till 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning worth of commitment. And people don't understand that, and perhaps they don't appreciate it. And certainly the Control Bureau have tried to look for new blood to come in to be referees. And many people say, we should have ex-riders becoming referees. And there are only 2 that I know of, which was Reg Trott, who rode for West Ham and Eastbourne, and Mick Bates, who rode at Mildenhall, who actually went into refereeing from riding. When you speak to riders about it, because there have been a few riders who we have felt would be good to be referees, but when you explain what is required and what remuneration they will get for it, they're just not interested. And but we do need younger people coming through into the sport.
And of course, you've seen many different eras, and even though you're not refereeing yourself now, your son Craig is, and as I say, he's an FIM referees some of the Speedway Grand Prix series and a lot of the top matches in British Speedway as well. So through him, you must see how things have changed. Perhaps the workload has changed, the challenges and pressures have changed over the period in the referee's box.
Yes, indeed. I mean, when Craig goes off to do the FIM meetings, the Grand Prix or World Championship events, there is a protocol to go through. And firstly, the referee has got to get himself to the venue, which might be anywhere in Europe or the other side of the world. And that's down to the referee to organise his own arrangements. So that can be quite challenging and a big deal. Usually practice is the day before the event, so the referee needs to be there by the night before the practice. Practice probably takes all day, pretty much 5 or 6 hours at least, and then on race day the referee will be at the meeting a good 4 or 5 hours prior to the meeting, because there is a series of jury meetings and protocol to go through. So it's not just a case of rocking up 10 minutes before the start and pressing a few buttons. There is a lot to take in and a lot to do and cover. Looking back
on the meetings that you have refereed, like the big meetings, which are the meetings that you look back on in your career with particular pride, or maybe people say, "Oh, what a great meeting that was," and you can sort of say, "Well, yeah, I know, I refereed it." Any of those?
Yeah, I mean, I was very lucky because I'm not sure it was the last or next to the last British League Riders Championship at the Old Hyde Road. And I certainly remember Hans Nielsen and Ulrich Gunderson being in the meeting. And the place was full. There were 20,000 people there, and that was a big deal. And it was a very prestigious event. And that certainly sticks out in my mind. And likewise, the British finals at Coventry back in the 80s, early 90s, when the stadium was packed, they were very big, and it was a big day and a big deal to do things like that. But also some of the test matches, England versus America or Denmark, they stand out, as being equally as exciting in that respect. But a simple old league match between Stoke and Berwick, that could equally be as good, and one or two of those stand out in my memory.
And whilst, of course, you can't be partisan, you are clearly a Speedway fan. You understand the sport, you love the sport, you used to be a supporter and go and watch a team. But you can still, whilst being a referee, surely have an appreciation of a great meeting and some great racing.
You can. Obviously, you're not cheering for a rider, you're not cheering for a club or a country, but you do appreciate the close racing. A good race for a referee to referee is when all four riders are spread out and there's no overtaking, because nothing is going to happen. But there are meetings when the racing is so fast and furious and tight and tense that you're on your feet, you're on edge all the time, looking at every bend at all the four riders and watching in case something happens that you have to adjudicate on. And but I mean, some meetings, simple meetings like 14 tournaments, I can remember some of the racing had been outstanding, going back years and years. And one in particular, I think, was at Wolverhampton. So there would have been Cradley, Wolverhampton, Bradford, and possibly Bellevue. And every single race was a gem. It was brilliant the whole evening. And I often wondered, why can't it be like that every night?
As a referee, you will at times find yourself in a tricky situation, a controversial situation that isn't perhaps going to please riders or fans sometimes. And you found yourself at the centre of one of those, well, I'm sure a number of those, but one in particular was discussed in the Speedway Star recently, and it was from England versus USA, the test match at Oxford in 1986, where you had to exclude Simon Wigg in quite bizarre circumstances, really, but you were following the rules as laid down, and that's your job as a referee, even though your head might have been saying something else. Just tell us about that particular incident at that event.
Yes, it was probably one of the worst calls I ever had to make, was that, because the lad, Simon, he'd done nothing wrong, really, other than tried to entertain the crowd. Leading up to the actual meeting, it was England versus USA Test match series. So I think there were 3 or 4 matches. Prior to that, there'd been several incidents where riders had pulled wheelies, particularly on the starting line at the parade when they didn't have helmets on. And there'd been a couple of several quite serious ones where somebody had become injured as a result of pulling wheelies. Now, at that time, the Americans, that was what they did. That was part of their makeup and their entertainment value and their charisma and charm. And so the control board said, prior to the test matches, we don't want to see any wheelies being done during these meetings. Will you please make sure the Americans behave themselves, targeting the Americans, because they're the ones, most English riders couldn't pull wheelies at that time. And I remember the riders briefing, sitting with all the riders and saying, whatever you do, do not pull a wheelie, because the penalty will be an exclusion. And, you know, the American guy said, fine, okay, we understand that. And and in fact, everybody behaved themselves impeccably in that respect during the meeting until the final race, when Simon Wigg was about to complete a 15-point maximum, and he was one of the few English riders who could do wheelies. And coming out of the fourth bend, he popped his wheel in the air and went down over the start-finish line on one wheel. And I excluded him because that is what I told the riders would happen at the time. Luckily, it didn't affect the result of the meeting, so I got out of jail in that respect. But what a thing to do, to exclude somebody for getting a 15-point maximum. But he was told, along with everybody else, do not do this, because if you do, you'll suffer an exclusion. And the place went crazy, and I was lucky to get out alive, to be honest. But I remember Bobby Schwartz, the Morans, Dennis Sigalos, Lansking coming to see me straight after the meeting, and they said, we don't like what you've just done, but we fully respect it and congratulate you for doing what you've done, because that's what you said you would do. And so that was the event of that afternoon or that evening, which is not a good one, really.
But it comes down to, I suppose, that's the referee's role, though, isn't it? You don't make the rules. You're there to enforce the rules, and you know, you're kind of the messenger in a way, aren't you? You're just enforcing the protocols laid down, I guess. Yes,
the referee's a policeman, and if you ask a policeman what he thinks of some of the punishments, they'll think they're terrible, but they're there to do a job, you know, that somebody else in authority has told them to do, and that was the case on that particular meeting. And you know, it was one of the worst things I've ever had to do, and because I always got on with Simon, and after that incident, we still got on very well together, and it's just so sad the way things turned out for Simon with his health and losing his life. But that is one very controversial thing to do. And likewise with my son in Grand Prix, he doesn't want to exclude a rider for touching the tapes. He doesn't want that at all. He wants to see the four riders in a race. He doesn't want to spoil the meeting, you know, but he doesn't write the rules.
And the view that a referee gets in a meeting is often very different depending on where you are, isn't it? And I think many fans probably think the referee always has the best view of the start line, the best view of the racing, but that's not always the case, is it? And whilst there are some good ones, I'm sure that not every referee's box is equal, is it?
Not at all. I mean, there are some very poor boxes. For example, Powder Hall at Edinburgh, which was a very, very pretty stadium, with flower beds on the centre green. But the referee box was a garden shed tucked away in the grandstand. And whoever built the box, they didn't take into account small people. They thought everybody was over 6 foot tall. And so I could never see out of the window. I had to stand on 2 beer crates throughout the meetings there to watch the racing. Hackney was another very poor box because that wasn't in line with the start and finish line, and it was tucked away at the end of the grandstand. And likewise, Newcastle, during the 80s and 90s, the box there was on the first bend, literally. So you weren't in line with the start line. And Wolverhampton, even today, is not directly in line with the start line. And in fact, in my career, when I've done TV meetings from Wolverhampton, I've actually started the races by looking at the TV monitor and not looking at the riders across at the start line. When the cameraman has angled his camera in such a way, I can see far more from the monitor than I can actually looking directly at the start line. Having said all that, there were some really good boxes. The old Hyde Road at Bellevue was brilliant. You were looking directly, the riders were underneath you. Coventry, likewise, the riders were below you. Halifax, that was the same. Kings Lynn used to be the same, but I think they've now moved the box slightly. Stoke, again, the riders were down underneath you pretty much. So those were the really good boxes where, you know, you could get a really good view of most things that happen. The ones that are tucked away at the back of the grandstand, such as Peterborough and Poole, they're slightly more difficult because you've got fans in front of you, which doesn't help, particularly when you're excluding their riders. But the fans actually get a better view of the starts than what the referee does. So there are some good ones, but you've got to take, you know, the rough with the smooth. I mean, at Sheffield, the box there has always been really, really good until they decided to build a fire escape ladder onto the box for health and safety reasons. And the ladder now blocks your view of the rider on the outside gate if he's on a handicap race. So there are little few issues like that the referee has to take into account. And in some of the boxes as well, the control panel is not in front of you. It's to the side. At the old Middlesbrough, it was on a wall to the left, so your hands would be touching the wall and your head would be looking out of the window. So you had to get your fingers in position on the right buttons because you couldn't look to see. But every box had its own quirk. But the good ones were places like Bellevue, Coventry, Oxford. They were all really good.
And we're speaking with was it Jordan Palin, I think, when we chatted to him. So it's one for your Ben Fund meeting. But he was saying that obviously he's learning the tricks now from some of the old masters in terms of counting between the green light going on and the tapes going up. And that some referees, that the riders know how long a certain referee leaves between the green light coming on and the tapes going up, and which is bonkers, but obviously it is a thing, and that's how you get some riders obviously not jumping the starts or getting lucky with the start, shall we say. How do referees vary that? Is it something you have to be conscious of, that you're not getting into a pattern of bang bang or whatever it is that you do?
It is, and it's very easy to slip into that route of quickening the starts, particularly if things are going quite well. I mean, back in the beginning for me, riders were allowed to touch the tapes, go into the tapes, and quite often you would hold the start for 10, 15 seconds. But in those days, the engines weren't revving like they are today, so it wasn't quite so important. The tape touching rule improved starting 1,000%, and it enabled starts to be much, much fairer. But back in the sort of 90s and the early 2000s, the control board put a timer switch in every box, and the timer had to be set for 2 seconds, a minimum of 2 seconds. So even 10, 15 years ago, the starts were being held a lot longer than they are today. Today, the bikes, they won't stay revving up at such a high rev for so long that you know, it has to be done within a couple of seconds. If there's a bit of movement at the tapes, the referees quite rightly hold the tapes to try and get the fairest of start possible. But the trick really is to vary the starts a little bit so that the riders can't anticipate them too much, but to vary them not enough so that there's a 3-4 second delay in one heat and then just a 1 second delay in the next heat. And I think the regulations, they say that all 4 riders must be stationary when the tapes go up. So quite often you could achieve that in 1.5 seconds, or it may take 1.5 or 2 seconds to achieve that. But Jordan's right. He should look at every referee because some referees are a little bit quicker than others. And Ivan Major had a book on referees. He had a notebook, and he made notes about every single referee. And I know that because his son Kim showed me the book only 3 or 4 years ago, and he said, "Do you know, Paul, you're in my dad's book." So,
and what was there a particular note against your name?
He wouldn't read out what his dad had put.
Paul Ackroyd is my guest, one of British Speedway's longest-serving referees. He's now retired, although he's handed the baton on to his son Craig, who you'll probably recognise that name from the Grand Prix circuit and across British Speedway too. And next, we will find out what Paul Ackroyd's dream Speedway meeting will look like. He's seen a lot of different riders and stadiums over his time and countless races, thousands of them through the course of his career, and will design his dream Speedway meeting next on Humans of Speedway. You're listening to Humans of Speedway. I'm Ian Brannan. My guest in this episode is another person who has literally dedicated their entire life to the sport of Speedway, both in the referee's box for a number of decades and now as the chair of the Speedway Riders Benevolent Fund, which is a unique charity, the only charity in the world dedicated to supporting injured riders who become injured through exploits in British Speedway. He is Paul Ackroyd, and Paul right now is going to design his dream Speedway meeting. Now, having seen thousands of heats through the course of his career in Speedway across a number of decades, 70s, 80s, 90s, noughties, up to the present day, he's got a wealth of experience to draw on. First of all, though, Paul, I will ask you this question. If you were going to host your dream Speedway meeting, which track would you choose purely for the racing spectacle?
It has to be in this current day and age. It has to be the New Bellevue, because everybody raves about that track around the world. So the current Bellevue would have to be certainly well up there. But the old Bellevue at High Road, that was certainly one of the best. In my experience. And a third track to throw in there would be Cradley Heath. Cradley Heath was always fast, furious, always produced really, really good racing, plenty of overtaking. But in this current state, I think the Bellevue track now is pretty much perfect. And, if I was opening a new speedway somewhere, the dimensions of that track, they would be what you would gauge your track on. And
yeah, and obviously a lot of research went into that, and in many ways trying to bring back some of the magic of Hyde Road as well, when Chris Morton and co were devising it, and they've certainly hit on something there, haven't they?
I think so. And it's a shame that we've got places, well, it's no longer with us now, but Somerset, and you've got Scunthorpe and Redcar, and it's a shame we didn't have Bellevue before they were opened and since closed in the case of Somerset, because maybe they would have, with a blank piece of paper, would have tried to copy or get somewhere near to what the current Bellevue is. And for some reason or other, the track at Bellevue, it just lends itself for overtaking and passing, and that's what the fans want, and that's the exciting bit of it. And whilst we have some nice stadiums and good tracks, for some reason or other, Bellevue seems to provide everything really for the riders, and the riders love going there.
Great to see some tracks coming back in, and this season particularly, of course, Oxford is a track that's getting new life breathed back into it, and I'm sure there'll be some memories for you from that track when it's back up and running this season.
Yes, there will indeed, and I plan to go there as much as possible. In particular, as two of my grandchildren live in Oxford, so it would be wrong of me not to take them. But yeah, Oxford was a nice stadium. You could enjoy a nice meal and a night out there. And what my memory serves me is that there's always some fairly good racing. So that's really good, and it's credit to the people who have, for the last 10 or 15 years or whatever, have not given up on hope of having that Speedway back there. So it's a full credit to those people for persevering.
And it is great that we're seeing these tracks come back. Say the North Side obviously is seeing development at the time of the recording this as well, and that's coming along. And the track that you first went to, Odsall, Bradford, is in a state now where it's got stock cars on it. The shale is back down. No speedway as yet, but sort of frustratingly close to it being possible now, whereas a few years ago it seemed like it would never happen.
It is, and one kind of lives in hope that one day Speedway will return. In particular, as I was born less than a mile away from that stadium. That was my hometown when I was a child, before emigrating to Lancashire. And I've spoken to people who have been to stock car meetings there, and that appears to have gone quite well. I'm really not sure whether Bradford would hold a team together now. Pretty much the Halifax people are gone. I can't imagine there'd be many people left who would go from Halifax to Bradford. And likewise, a lot of the old Odsall supporters, it would be difficult to get them back on board. However, we live in hopes, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it would be great to see even just one event there and just see how it goes, I think. But
it would.
Just for the and there's no shortage of riders queuing up to ride it. I can tell you that. There will be no shortage of riders wanting to go. Stadium then, which if we're going to put the Bellevue track in a stadium for the atmosphere, which stadium would you go for?
I think pretty much it would have to be somewhere like Poole, where you've got some decent facilities down there. You've got a lovely grandstand on the back straight with restaurant facilities, and a decent grandstand on the home straight, and viewing on the third and fourth bend. So I think a track like Bellevue would be quite spectacular at Poole, or somewhere like Poole.
And your all-time 1 to 7 is the next thing. So who would be racing in your team?
You would have Eric Gunderson.
Yes.
Sean Moran.
Oh, yes. All the classics.
Eric Lucock.
Yes.
Jason Lyons. Chris Pusey.
Yes.
Kenny Carter.
Of course.
And Joe Owen.
You've got a good mix of northern riders there, I think.
Yeah, but apart from Eric,
who
was at Cradley Heath, for various reasons, each of those people are quite special, and they were good in lots of different ways. And looking through, there's a whole list of people who you would chuck in there, but that would be one of my dream teams. And
a couple of classic, iconic Halifax names in there in Eric Bucock and Kenny Carter. And I guess in Eric Bucock's case, you grew up watching him and then ended up refereeing him, and has been, a key part of the sport in Britain for so long. I imagine you've had many great conversations over the years with Eric. Many. Eric rode at Halifax from 1965.
he never rode for another club, having started with Middlesbrough and then went to Halifax, and he stayed there. He was the first rider ever to get a testimonial meeting for being at a club for more than 10 years. He was an England international. He was pretty much top of the averages for something like 10 years on the trot. And, you know, when you support a team, your number one rider, you don't expect him to get beaten. And there were only a few occasions where he did round at Halifax. And he was super professional. I obviously know Eric a lot, but, you know, in those days I used to pay money to go and watch him. And, you know, he never disappointed. So he was an ultra-professional. And Chris Pusey, he rode at Bellevue, the old Bellevue, and then spent 2 or 3 years at Halifax. And he was, for me, one of the all-time great team riders. And he could throw his bike anywhere on the track. And he could get his teammate round for a 5-1 in most races. And he was just so good, such a special rider, an ex-grass track rider. And it would have been lovely to see him perform today on today's bikes. Kenny Carter, you don't have to say anything about Kenny. I knew him quite well. He was racing and I was refereeing, and he was good to work with. Never a minute's trouble. He blew hot and cold like everybody does, but he was great to work with, and we got on ever so well. And like everybody, we were devastated what happened.
Yeah.
And Eric Gunderson, likewise, he was a professional. He was very approachable. We had a lot of fun when he was racing and I was refereeing. He was part of the team that I was speaking about earlier, where you'd have a chat in the bar afterwards. And he was a great rider. And to see him win that world final at Bradford, that was the manoeuvre he made where he cut inside, I think it was Sean Moran and somebody else. It was unbelievable, and it was such a sad end to his career. And Jason Lyons, he follows into the same mould as some of the other guys. He was never a minute's trouble. He was always good. His father was a referee in Australia, so he understood the situation, and he was always brilliant to work with. But Joe Owen, it's such a sad state that he ended up like he did in a wheelchair, because Joe was a brilliant rider in his day. He was a pin-up boy at the time, very good looking, a very big female following, and he would have been he would fit in perfectly in today's Speedway with his looks and the way he rode and the ability that he had. And Joe was quite a tall lad, so he carried a lot more weight than some of the other riders, and but he was able to beat everybody on his day, and he looked super cool. So such a sad end to his career.
There's a big difference between riders then and now, isn't there? You know, the stuff that they used to get up to, both on the track and off the track. You know, they had much more interaction with fans, and fans could get closer to them as well, as you mentioned before, in the bar afterwards. Whereas, you know, these days, of course, riders have got that professional element to them, and they've got many more commitments as well. They are maybe a little bit more distant from fans versus those of the era of the 50s, 60s, 70s and so on.
But I think they are very much so. They're very much protected, and they're very insular in the way they are, and they've got their little pit bay with the headphones on and a team of people running around them, and life has changed, and there's no flamboyant characters anymore. And whereas in the 80s and 90s there was, people were more of a showman type in those days, whereas now they're professional sportsmen. And I don't think entertainment comes into their category. I don't think it's in their mindset anymore. And a little cliche on that is many, many, many years ago, there used to be a rider called Vic Lonsdale, and he rode at Bradford and Newcastle. And one day, this would be in the late 60s, early 70s, he came out for his first ride, and he came down the steps out of the bar with a cigarette in his mouth and a bottle of brown ale in his hand, and walked onto the centre green and put his helmet on, and then sat on his bike, and off he went. And those are the type of things that you wouldn't have today, but those are the things that were very amusing, and the press latched onto, and so on. And in some ways, we've become a little bit sterile with the racing. Whilst it's exciting, there are no showmen now. There are no people out to entertain the public, and because they are more professional sportsmen. You'd have riders jumping off of a bike, going down the straight onto the back of somebody else, and having a fisticuff, and you'd have incidents like riders being parked outside the bikes outside the pit gate ready for the race, and the home track manager ploughing over the bikes, and digging them into the ground because it was a last heat decider. And you'd have all those sorts of things going on. You'd have, the team manager like Neil McFarland, he'd be on the centre green waving his hands around on the phone, and then he'd rip the phone off the hook, and all he was doing was generating interest for the following night, for the replay at Glasgow. And that's the bit that the fans miss now, I think. Team managers don't go out on the centre green anymore like they used to do. And people like John Berry and Martin Rogers, they were always out on the centre green, always. And that could be quite intimidating for the referee, when a team manager stood right in front of the tapes, and you had to be sharp in those days to do with those people. But sadly, a lot of that fun element is now gone, and it's frowned upon.
Next, then, is a question for you. If you were going to have a referee for your meeting, who would referee your meeting? You'd be not spoilt for choice, I would have thought.
Well, no, there isn't really. However, the Bonanza meeting, so far, we've had a different referee for each of the Bonanzas, and this year, my son has been allocated to referee the meeting. So Craig's going to get a shot at Peterborough in a few weeks' time. So yes, I would have to have my own son, wouldn't I?
Yeah, it's a reasonable shout.
Yeah.
Do you think your grandkids will eventually take up refereeing and continue this dynasty?
Not too sure. They two of them are very, very much into football, and two have actually begun playing now as school children.
Yeah.
They do enjoy Speedway. I took them to Redcar one day last year, and they had a thoroughly enjoyable evening. Cheering for the home team, they were. I'm not sure.
You can never tell.
I have my doubts whether there'll be another Ackroyds coming into it.
Who knows? Watch this space. If you were going to change one rule of Speedway, what would that be?
I'd like to see something done regarding the gardening at the gates. There isn't a rule in there, but I would like. I think the board tried to put something in place at some point, but I'd love to see something that stopped the gardening going on, because the fans hate it and the referees hate it, and it just winds everybody up. And a simple way of resolving that would be that the referee put the 2-minute light on, the timer, and exactly after 2 minutes, the starting gate went up.
Yeah.
And if the riders weren't ready, then that's their fault. That would be a simple way. I'm not sure how that would work, but so that is a rule I would love to see implemented. Not too sure about a rule that I would change, because there are so many, and there's so many that could be misconstrued in different ways. But that particular one is something I'd like to see improved.
I suppose we do see it in Poland and in the GPs, don't we, where the clock's on and you've got the clock on the centre green, and that 2 minutes is, there for everybody to see, and that's 2 minutes to the race time, isn't it, I think?
Well, no, that's 2 minutes for the riders to be at the start line.
Right. Oh, so 2 minutes to tapes up. You're talking about
2 minutes to come under the start marshal's orders. But that can take half a minute getting them sorted out. The start marshal pulling a rider forward and another one moves back, and then and you see them going up and down the line, don't you? And I don't know. It's so hard, but Poland have tried, and in the Grand Prix now, they've got this automatic system where an electronic device releases the tapes and not the referee. And it was interesting last year. Some of the starts they had quite long delays, much more than ever what a referee would hold them, and the riders managed to keep still and reacted okay with it. And then in other races, the starts were very, very quick. But I'm not particularly in favour of that. The start should be under the referee's control, and not an electronic device. If you have an electronic device, you might as well just set the 2 minute timer on, and the tapes go up after 2 minutes, like I've just explained.
Yeah, it must have been weird for Craig when he's in doing these meetings and pressing a button and then maybe something not happening for 2 or 3 seconds.
It's like having your right hand taken away from you, is that. And because you're in such a routine procedure of what you do, how you're looking at things, to suddenly lose a function of that.
Yeah, it must be a pretty odd experience to be in the box with that system. Final question then for you, Paul, is who would be the opposition for your dream team then, racing in this imaginary event? And this can be any team, an actual team that has existed at any point in history.
I think it would have to be Oxford in kind of like the 1985-86 period.
Yeah.
Ipswich again in the 80s. They were always a force to be reckoned with, particularly when you were refereeing and they were in town, wherever you were, and they were coming or you were going there, you had to be on your game, you had to be sharp, and they were very intimidating teams at the time with intimidating team managers. So they would be probably the top two. But also, the year Bradford won the league with an English team, that should be mentioned. They've been very credible, and so that would be a good team to have.
You can have Eric Bucock racing and managing the opposition.
Yes, yeah, that would be good. Yeah.
Well, it's been great speaking with you, Paul. Thanks very much for sharing some of your stories over the last hour or so, and all the very best of luck with the Ben Fund Bonanza when it takes place at the end of March.
Yeah, thank you for having me on your programme, and to all you supporters out there, if you could come along, that would be brilliant. We will certainly try to give you an entertaining day or afternoon, and without those people, we couldn't have the Ben Fund. So your attendance to that meeting is your donation, your commitment to the fund. So please come along if you possibly can, everybody.
And that date for your diary then, one more time, it is the 27th of March. It's a Sunday afternoon, 2:00 start at Peterborough's East of England Showground. Please get there if you can for some top-class racing and, of course, doing your bit for charity as well. Check out social media for details of the riders taking part and all the other news you need as we get closer to the event. My thanks to Paul Ackroyd for joining us, the chair of the Speedway Riders Benevolent Fund, for telling us about the charity and also sharing some of his experiences of the life of a referee. Please listen back to some of the previous episodes. Recent guests include Lewis Kerr, Tom Brennan, Jordan Palin and Jordan Jenkins, and we've got many more in the back catalogue as well, including Chris Morton, Gary Havelock, Jeremy Doncaster, David Howe, and journalists such as Phil Lanning and Peter Oakes amongst the guests. Plenty more to listen back to at your leisure. We'll be back with more new episodes very soon. And don't forget to follow us and subscribe to this podcast and on social media as well for all the updates when we've got news to share. And that's it for Humans of Speedway. Feel free to leave us a review or a rating if you like, and we'll catch you on the next episode. Take care, and we'll speak soon.
Sports Social Podcast Network.
Looking for a fun way to win up to 25 times your money this football season? Test your skills on Prize Picks, the most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Just select 2 or more players, pick more or less on their projection for a wide variety of statistics, and place your entry. It's as easy as that. If you have the skills, you can turn $10 into $250 with just a few taps. Easy gameplay, quick withdrawals, and an enormous selection of players and stat options are what make Prize Picks the #1 daily fantasy sports app. Ready to test your skills? Join the Prize Picks community of more than 7 million football fans who have already signed up. Right now, Prize Picks will match your first deposit up to $100. Just visit prizepicks.com/get100 and use code GET100. That's code GET100 at prizepicks.com/get100 for a first deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks, daily fantasy sports made easy.